lone general stands upon a naval vessel and stares out at an endless span of coastal cliffs. Ichorq sighs, head heavy with pondering and gray hair. She wears heavier clothing than the last time she was here. Everything was not quite the same, but there were now constants to the coastlines of the tide pool lane's territory. Gouges in the sand hundreds of feet long, cracked pieces of cliff rock strewn around the jagged base, and a humongous pile of decaying coral. She thinks about what they learned not more than a month before, that something else could be out there. Something worse than the problem the Ichorq recently rid themselves of. Ichorq drifts back to the first day of the revolution, when she was brought on as a strategist to aid in felling a careless overlord. The days they fought the Lord of Coral. The vessel she arrived on was small, covert and swift. She boarded those frequently back then, as her talents were hard to precede her growing reputation as one of the most brilliant strategists this side of the equator. Preferably, she traveled by land. The rocking of waves made her woozy and clogged her thinking, but her contact was insistent this would be the best way to arrive. Several miles southeast of the incident, she docked in a wharf of a small port. Business was burgeoning. That, or there was a freak influx of migrants. The entire port was ransacked with workers. So many that Ichorq had a difficult time seeing what jobs they were rushing around to do. Judging by the abundance of weapons racks and the multitude of members from different veins, they were not trading mere luxury goods. There were even pockets of humans, which Ichorq found especially odd. I was beginning to think your voyage was met with tribulations. A man with pale blue skin dressed in a calf-length coat walked briskly to Ichorq's pier. Ichorq Gaunt, if I'm not mistaken. I prefer my name whispered, Quintarius, Ichorq replied. The naval officer waved it off. Bah, you think any around here cares much for a random passerby? Besides, they're too engrossed in labor to pay you any attention. And exactly what kind of labor would that be? Ichorq asked. She took position next to Quintarius, scrutinizing the strange cooperation surrounding the wharf. What task have you summoned me for? Quintarius's broad grin somehow grew. He winked. I'm very, very glad you asked that, dear consultant. Come, there's much to discuss before the meeting. They toured the operation. Ichorq noted many of the buildings looked new, not a wear or tear from time amongst storehouses or walled barracks. Quintarius elaborated on the various tasks that were being done as they passed by them. Several groups were constructing massive war machine parts. From their size, Ichorq gauged some could launch harpoons nearly as long as ship masts. Others simply hauled crates on wheeled contraptions or carried by hulking masses of muscle and chitin. Ricoro, Quintarius explained. Hard-working, incredibly strong, but not the brightest of mind. Each group of workers passed, Ichorq would ask a few questions, and Quintarius would answer openly. She found this strange. Typically, her correspondents withheld some of their agenda, or would beat around the bush. Finally, they went inside an older building, refurbished, with draping banners and sentinels placed out front. Quintarius had no issue getting them by. Moving into a large rectangular room inside, there was a table laden with a map, various measurement tools, and hand-carved wooden pieces clumped around various spots. A war table. Those were something Ichorq was familiar with. What she wasn't familiar with were the other occupants. Two others from the shattered earth vein stood vigilant across the table, both with the characteristic dark hazel skin and craggy brow line. They appeared related, father and son maybe, with the son going off about different tactics they could employ. The father nodded listlessly, attention firmly placed on Ichorq as she and Quintarius entered. His eyes held about as much warmth as a steel sword left out in the snow. They were gray, sharp, and cruel. Rovum Nuqueris, Ichorq spoke, giving a slight bow. An honor to finally meet you in person. Rovum's son paused his explanation, eyes darting between Ichorq and his father. Rovum's expression did not change as he addressed Ichorq. Ichorq Gaunt, I've heard passing rumors of your appearance here. Was beginning to think Quintarius was full of bilge. You'd be half right in that, came another voice. At one corner of the war table nestled a scrawny Ichorq with pale blue skin, nearly white, Their stringy silver hair was wild and frayed, eyes narrow, constantly blinking. Quintarius has long since acquired a reputation for being an eccentric facade. All his neat little plans wrapped up with sweet-scented lies. Gyre, Quintarius warned, still somehow keeping a pleasant smile. You do well to keep your own eccentricities in check while our esteemed guests are present. Gyre straightened his back and gave a lax salute. Aye, aye, Admiral. Ichorq fell into place next to Quintarius, Gyre on his left, and Rovum straight across from her. The notorious warmonger's eyes hardly strayed from her, only taking cautionary glances whenever someone else entered the room. Ichorq guessed most were lesser advisors, about a dozen in total split between Tidepool and Shattered Earth representatives, with the majority being the Prior. Then the last advisor came in, someone whose skin was hued a minor yellow, and eyes and hair resembled a summer storm. Rovum's expression finally soured. What are they doing here? The southern gale, Ichorq flashed her teeth. Rovum, if I chance to guess. My name is Trevelli, here to represent my people. But if what I imagine we're here for is true, then we won't be together for long. What are we here for, exactly? Ichorq interrupted. Quintarius has been quite good at avoiding that topic, which I will withhold no longer. Quintarius nodded to Trevelli as she casually leaned against her corner of the table. I have requisitioned you all here today for a singular purpose, one that will change the very fabric of our society, of every society. Roughly 11 leagues northwest of us slumbers the Lord of Coral, recovering from a recent bloodletting with the fire of Rumbling Plains. It is within the entirety of the Tidepool Vein's intentions to kill the Lord of Coral. Silence permeated the room. Ichorq knew exactly the weight Quintarius's words held. The Titans who ruled their world were the very same ones that gave life to everything on it by having their blood cascade to the earth. The blood of the Titans gave birth to the Ichorq, whose sole job was to be caretakers of all the other beings they create, to do the bidding of their lord's will and cultivate any that they create, or to destroy those they deem unnecessary mistakes. More often than not, this led to the Ichorq purging many beasts' lives merely because the Titans willed it. Sometimes the animals they slay were sentient, but such was the way of the world. Such was the binding power of blood. The advisors erupted in a mixture of outrage and delirium. Rovum's expression was as solid as ever. Trevelli's was playful, as if she already predicted the outburst and won some sort of bet. Quintarius waited until everyone was calm before continuing. For far too long we have been beneath the heels of our tyrants. Many have seen the destruction of their people by our hands, simply because those who created them didn't bother to care. Erased as mere experiments to make way for far greater things. And how long until we are replaced with more competent help? I say a rather tantalizing opportunity has arisen. One too tempting to pass on. What you are saying is blasphemy, someone cried. We cannot even comprehend going against our Titans. They would not allow it. Ichorq shared a look with Quintarius. Something in his eyes made cunning swirls. Ah, but you see, that is where you are wrong. Our primordial bindings are tied to how close our bond is with the Titans. I've personally made sure that all here are 5th generation or more. Rovum's son tilted his head back. Far enough so we don't have to follow their orders, but our blood is still potent. Very astute, Troy Nuquaris. My thoughts exactly. And we have plenty of help besides Ichorq. The Kasuana have no love for their creator, and neither do the Rokoro. Both have suffered heavy losses by the careless nature of the coastal titan. Environments torn apart, entire races born and extinguished within a lunar cycle. What makes you think you can pull this off? Ichorq said. Any titan's power is great, even those who are wounded. We trap them. Quintarius moved pieces on the war table, hands moving on their own, like he'd practiced this a million times. Wait for them outside the cave, then demolish it from within. What about their blood? Trevelli chimed. Wouldn't wounding a titan be the worst thing we can do? Their Ichor would sprout all sorts of horrors for us to deal with. Gyre cleared his throat. My turn to answer. You see, dear Southerner, my job is to organize the blood catchers. Pieces of this usurping puzzle started to fall into place for Ichorq. You're planning on stopping the blood from hitting the ground in the first place. Precisely. Which I will remind Quinty again that the pacing of this conflict is everything. If we wound it too fast, then the catchers can't catch quick enough. Not to mention the nightmare of cycling workers, and don't get me started on how difficult it is going to be storing it all on site. Quintarius kept shifting pieces around. One dwarfed the rest, surrounded by clusters of smaller wooden soldiers. We'll have strike teams to deal with any blood that slips past your catchers. We have plenty of ways to injure the Lord of Coral. It's mainly a matter of keeping it in a single spot for long enough. Ichorq picked up some pieces that looked like warriors riding atop iguanas. It would be extremely difficult to stop a Titan from moving where they wished. Exactly what countermeasures do you have for that? For the first time, Quintarius frowned. We have dug trenches, placed traps. Harassers will impede it from the air with the aid of the southern gale, and the riders will scale with Casawana to keep it occupied. What about the cliffs? War machines will make sure it strays coastward. It is the Lord of Coral, after all. It is strongest in the reefs, and it will stop at nothing to get to them. And if another Titan intervenes? We've kept tabs on the others. None are within 100 leagues of here. How strong is your ammunition? Can it actually pierce the Titan's skin? The table shook. Quintarius' fist slammed into it, jostling most of the pieces out of place. His eyes trained on Ichorq. Do you take me for a fool? Ichorq remained calm. She placed wooden soldiers back in their places. You misunderstand my intentions, Admiral. You hired me as a strategic consultant. As such, it is my duty to make sure your tactics are absolute. Ichorq rightened one of the many not-to-scale boat replicas. Keep relaying your plan. I will interrupt if I hear any unsound precautions. Quintarius heaved a shaky breath, then smiled, cheerful attitude present once more. Afternoon dwindled to evening as the Admiral went over his plan several times over. A few modifications were made, most by Ichorq, but some at the request of Rovum, and one from Trevelli that they should employ more harassment maneuvers. Gyre kept interrupting to state how important the flow of battle was, constantly reminding everyone else how crucial it was to keep the blood catchers properly cycling. Final preparations were made, diagrams drawn, hands shook. Ichorq contemplated the feat they were preparing to attempt in silence. She had little love of the Titans herself, but a part of her wondered what would happen after the damage was done. The day when this world was short one more Titan. And that day was right around the corner. Aside from the war preparations, the day was pleasant. Few clouds, bright blue sky, sandy beaches, lined by a 90-degree sheer of pale gray stone, interrupted only by a single gaping cavern several hundred feet tall. The sand line stretched far longer than it should, courtesy of the tide pool vein's efforts. Wooden spikes leaned toward the cave, tips coated in metal. Trenches were dug and fortified in the sand, filled with patient warriors. Hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers waited on the beach in their respective positions. Ichorq stood upon a command platform that had been raised atop a grassy mound jutting from sand near the waterline. Far away, an entire fleet of weaponized naval vessels idled, no doubt readying their payloads. Ichorq was surprised some of them could even float. A few were retrofitted as warships for this sole purpose, hulls dipping low into the wake from added modifications. Rows of war machines peeked over the cliff, mostly ballistae and cannons, but a handful of trebuchets were present on the off chance they needed it. Flocks of giant hawks circled overhead, Trevelli no doubt among them, eager to start. A great day for a siege. Rovum sauntered onto the command platform. Never seen such an effort in all my years. Ichorq gave him a glance, trying to gauge his mood. It was as unreadable as ever. It's not enough, she simply stated. Now that we know not for certain. Rovum leaned against the chipped railing. We never rightly caved in one of the bastards, now have we? This will be the ultimate test of the Ichorq. A true testament to the power of our blood. The power that they gave us, Ichorq reminded him. The warmonger's eyes finally shifted. A smidgen of suspicion which only intensified as his brow narrowed. Careful the words you speak, blood sibling, or you might have to face two enemies this day. Ichorq kept her eyes on the cavern. It will take much longer than a single day, Trust me on that. Rovum grunted in agreement. No one knew precisely when the Titan would wake, but it would be soon. It would desire to stretch and rejuvenate in the tides, the curling shallows that were not exactly where they left them. Minutes creeped by. An hour. Then it came. A drawn-out rumble in the earth. Both Ichorq and Rovum could feel it. Activity on the beaches halted. All eyes turned to the maw of the cliffs as a creator giant sluggishly emerged. The first thing that came out was the head. Lopsided and lumpy, it was as big as some ships, caked in layers upon layers of still living coral, mountains of barnacles smothering its hidden skin. One arm that could snap ancient trees with barely a flick of a finger grasped the edges of the cave to pull itself free. On the other side, 3 smaller arms aided in its movement by doing the same. Together they pulled the hulking body out of the cave. It was as if an entire coral reef had took the land. A swirling tempest of solid water rose from its right shoulder with the single arm. A cylinder of impossibility with schools of fish swimming around the vortex. Coming out of the cave, the Lord of Coral stood to its full 500-foot height, supported by cloven legs made of half sand, half sea glass. Ichorq couldn't tell if it had eyes, but she was sure they would be filled with surprise. Surprise and contempt. From Quintarius' flagship came a horn blast, the signal to start. From the edges of the cave flashed brilliant sparks, which were immediately swallowed by clouds of debris. Explosions echoed across the beach as the Titan's resting place crumbled behind it. Rovum raised his fist in the air, screaming, "Visanda Hakti!" A battle cry born of the shattered earth vein's many military triumphs. The cry rang out, even from those who did not share the same blood, and the siege began. Volleys of cannons roared. Powder flashes went off like celebratory lights. Bright streaks sailed through the air until they hit the Lord of Coral's immeasurably tough hide. It was unclear if the first volley did any real damage, because the smoke was still settling when the second barrage hit. Same with the third and fourth. Despite the cannon fire, everyone else needed to act fast. In set encampments dotted around the site, Ichorq moldiers went to work. Opening wounds on themselves, they let their own blood drip and pool around them. Using powers similar to the titans that bore them, they willed their life force to take the shape of weapons. Spears, swords, hammers, picks. Warriors took up arms, as the sooner they were used, the more potent they were. Scouts mounted the giant iguana-like Castuana and charged with their newly made armaments. Their mounts climbed up the Titan easily where they could find chips in the armor, gaps to prod and irritate it enough to keep its mind occupied. From both beach and cliff, siege engines took aim, launching titanic bolts at any recovering wounds they could see from the Lord of Coral's previous injuries. Some missed entirely, embedding their payload into the cliffside, even one decimating an unlucky group entrenched. Many hit, but found no leverage through the Titan's fortified armor. Only one struck true. The Lord of Coral roared as the first blood was spilt. Blood that would certainly cause problems if it wasn't caught before hitting the earth. Ichorq and Rovum watched as Gyre's bloodcatchers went to work, simultaneously the most dangerous job and the most important. Teams ran in tandem with stretchers. The swirling ichor of the Titan landed on the stretchers with only minor splashes, but it kept pouring. Switching out with another team right behind them, the catchers moved with such a tight schedule it was a wonder it could even be done. But some blood did escape. A drop to Titans is like a downpour to mortals. Small pools clumped at the Titan's feet, and from them clawed fresh beasts, no doubt instinctively designed to repel their attackers. Writhing masses of limbs reaching out desperately to seek their first prey, hopelessly clinging to the idea of solidified salvation. With trouble, the strike teams performed their jobs. Screams filled the gaps where cannon fire was absent. "Feel that?" Rovum paced the platform. "The might of a deity dwindling, slipping away like the rest of us." "It's nowhere near done," Ichorq reminded him. But it knows." "Knows what exactly?" "Mortality." Hours crept into the night where the siege continued. Bioluminescent material lit up the Lord of Coral. Calm teal and green lights streaming from its sea glass segments, now cracked with strain. Trickles of dried blood casted an ominous haze on the front lines. Soldiers barely got any time to rest or eat. Many didn't, instead following the work mantras they were given. Early morning on the second day, cracks began to form in the operation. The blood catchers were doing well enough. Gyre's constant obsession with perfect rotations made sure of that. But what blood wasn't being caught or pooled on the ground was a scattered mist. Mist that settled on the surface of the sands. Swarms of innumerable pests gnashed at the catchers' heels. Hermit crabs, sand lice, and numerous other vermin of the coast tore up their boots. Catchers had to replace their footwear constantly, and those who couldn't in time were carried away on stretchers, feet carved into a bloody mess. The Lord of Coral sought to make a break for it. To the north, defenses were stretched thin, and various tide pools were a glimmer of hope for the Titan. Taking slow, gargantuan steps, it moved toward them, still fending off the aerial harassments from the Eagle Riders. The first step in a tide pool was its mistake. The Titan's foot plunged into the water, and kept going. A faulty pool, dug out by the shattered earth vein, easily alluring by the veil of minimal defenses. Once tripped, the Titan lay on its knees where several launchers hurled weighted rope in an attempt to keep it down. Unsurprisingly, the bonds weren't nearly strong enough to resist the giant's strength, but the time it bought for the fleet's volleys more than made up for that. Near sunset on that second day, when the Titan was surrounded once more, a dreadful thing occurred. "What's it doing?" Rovum mumbled. Two of the Lord's smaller hands each grasped a finger of its larger one. It took minutes before the sickening cracks started, and by then it was too late to warn the ships. "What?" "No, no, no!" Rovum waved down their Southern Gale messenger and rambled off a message, but Ishal watched as they were too late. Snapping its own fingers clean off, the Lord of Coral drew back and flung them into the sea. They arced through the air like barnacle-encrusted eels and crashed into the water. For a brief moment, there was nothing. Then the waters churned as blood blossomed into something terrible. Two serpents breached the waves to assail the boats. Scales murky like ink, not yet fully formed, but the damage was done. Several ships went down due to their writhing mass, Quintarius' flagship included. Cannons rushed to re-aim. Squads of harpooners leaped overboard, some out of necessity, while others thrilled for revenge in the waters, where they'd be as equally maneuverable as the serpents. During the break in cannon fire, the Lord of Coral attempted another escape in the opposite direction. They took two humongous steps before a brilliant flash engulfed the beach. From it jutted a spire of earth, stabbing the Titan in the thigh. It let loose a ground-rumbling trill as it fell on its side. Many cheered at the repulsion. Ishal and Rovum knew better. They did damage, but at a steep cost. The only way an Ichorq could conjure such an impact was by giving their life in full. A powerful caster was just exchanged for the cause. The finger serpents didn't relent easily, and took more than a third of the ships down with them until their forms lay twitching in the blood-soaked bay. Night came and went. Stars blazed overhead as if they relished the fight, spotlighting the beach like a stage. More soldiers' lives were traded for chances of injuries. Reserve manpower had to be called in to help the blood catchers with their newfound troubles. Wounds opened from the Titan everywhere, spilling on the sands much faster than Gyre anticipated. The siege continued like this through most of the next day. Only when the sun started to set on the third day did the final blow transpire. Ishal knew things were grim. She calculated they had another half-day left before either morale broke or the entire operation ran out of steam. Ammunition was low, food was dire, equipment in shambles, manpower exhausted. Their only saving grace was the fact the Lord of Coral seemed as out of breath as everyone else. "It can't escape," Rovum reasoned. "If it were to run away on either side of the beaches, it would take heavy fire and we could chase it down. If it ran for the water, the ships could likely deal a killing blow, or at least slow it down. We've won." Ishal agreed. They've done it. After everything they've suffered, the Titan was finally winding down. It looked out of energy, and out of luck. Only a matter of time before... Ishal hardly thought of the idea before the Titan acted. Wait. It's fleeing. Call for the harassers to retreat to the cliff tops. It can't flee. Didn't you just... No. The bastard. Rovum's expression changed. Mild surprise. Irritation at the Titan's gall for its final attempt. Using its big arm, it ripped one of its smaller appendages clean off. Using it like a club, it lashed at the cliff tops, barely able to scrape it. But the damage was sufficient. Clouds of debris broke off, assaulting the artillery teams entrenched up top with a wave of shrapnel. Streams of what little blood the Titan had left waterfalled from the gargantuan wound. There'd be no way the blood catchers could secure it all. Strike teams would be too busy dealing with the aftermath to aid in pursuit. Volleys of cannons, ballista, and even javelins pelted the Lord of Coral's back, but it ignored them, opting instead to use its energy for one last attempt at escape. Forging its own handholds in the cliff, it began to climb. "Stop it!" Rovum screamed at the top of his lungs, a command that rolled across the war zone like a tremor in the sand. "Stop that beast! By my blood, do not let it get away!" Ixchel was out of ideas. Any she had would take far too long to relay to the teams placed up top. None of them ever thought the Lord of Coral would attempt to climb the cliffs. It was too open to reprisal, too easy to stop. The water would always be the more viable option. But having their defense up there temporarily dazed was a final gambit, one that might win in the face of a carefully crafted trap. Rovum got the attention of a Southern Gale messenger. Once they were close enough, the warmonger ripped them from their saddle and attempted to ride the eagle himself. Ixchel knew there was no way the general would let the Titan escape, even if it meant chasing it down himself. Many of the aerial harassers backed off the Lord of Coral, perhaps seeing the conflict's end, but most redoubled their efforts. They swooped in, claws raking, spears jabbing, all in an effort to halt the Titan. Just as the Lord of Coral was reaching for the top of the cliff, something caught Ixchel's attention. A singular gilded eagle rose from the front lines with two figures on its back. The eagle was no doubt Trevelli's. Predictable that the head representative from the Southern Gale would have their mount dressed overly flashy during a siege, but they were too far away for Ixchel to make out who the other passenger was. They flew in tight circles to rise higher than the cliffs. They paused for a few breathless moments, circling the air above the Titan's head, waiting for something. "Incompetent featherbrain!" Rovum cursed the eagle at Pectum. Ixchel called to him and pointed at the scene. Rovum's eyes threatened to flare up, but he watched on. Suddenly, as the Titan's larger hand gripped the cliff, the other person jumped from Trevelli's eagle. Whomever it was dove at a slight angle, heading straight towards the hand. That was the final miracle of the siege. Midway to the ground, the person glowed briefly before light gave way to earth. A jagged spear of massive size carried their momentum with grace. A shockwave penetrated the air, followed by a booming crack as the spear impaled the Lord of Coral's hand against the cliff's edge. The Titan let loose a faint rumble. The cliff cracked from the impact, splitting apart. Without anything to anchor themselves to, the Lord of Coral fell in a hurricane of sand. A blast of coastal dust that reached Ixchel and even out to the ships. When the sand settled, the siege halted, waiting, hoping that the Titan would not rise. When it didn't, a cheer erupted, one that released all the anger, frustrations, each oppressed dream that the Titan's creations contained throughout the ordeal. Instead of relief, Ixchel felt a void blossom in her stomach. She looked over at Rovum to see his reaction. His face, as always, was cast in stone. Everyone around them was focused on the titanic body in the sand. Rovum's gaze lingered on the shattered shaft of the spear that did the final blow. A single tear welled up in his stalwart eyes as he gave a soft salute. In that moment, Ixchel knew the general would not see his eldest son again. Gyre barged up onto the command platform, a wicked grin complementing his wild, sleepless eyes. "Well, I'd say this is a great time to be alive. We're the first to overcome the impossible." And now, Ixchel thought, because of our victory we will not be the last to do so. Instead of feeling hope, or satisfaction, or accomplishment, when she looked at the mountain of fallen coral, she felt like the Ichorq just made a grave mistake.